It's good to see you all again today. I hope you had some rest after the very interesting and intensive sessions that we had for day one of the symposium. My name is Natalie McGuire. I'm one of the curators here at the Barbados Museum, and I'm very pleased to be chairing session 5 for kicking us off on day 2 of the symposium with presentations by Dr. Michael Morris and Dr. Daisha Osborne. They are co-editing a new series from Edinburgh University Press titled Scotland and Empire. So if anybody's working on a paper or interested in a publication, I believe they're accepting any expressions of interest regarding that series. I'm pleased to introduce the first speaker for this session, Dr. Michael Morris, who will be presenting on Charles Campbell's prison memoir, Argyll, Jamaica and the Radical War. Dr. Michael Morris is Senior Lecturer in English Literature at the University of Dundee. His research examines Scottish connections with slavery and the Black Atlantic, and his monograph, Scotland and the Caribbean, circa 1740 to 1833, Atlantic Archipelagos, was published in 2015. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Morris.
Okay, hello. Can you hear me? Okay. I am under strict instructions to speak slowly and to enunciate. So I will do my best. Just to say thank you very much to the organisers, to Pedro and to Nigel for bringing us out here, and for the amazing welcome from the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. It's been a wonderful event. I would like to begin with Cass Ezeji's work, which has explored the relationship between the African diaspora and Scottish Gaels since 2015. For example, her programme for BBC Alaba's series Trúsach coined and introduced the term Afro-Gael. This is a kind of a version of what we have tended to call over the decades kind of Black British, more recently Afro-Scots or Afro-Scottish, and this is now kind of devolving it even further into a specific term of Afro-Gael, where Cass Ezeji and others feel that it's a term which gives them a sense of comfort in exploring their own identities. Ezeji's writing in magazines and journals such as Scottish Affairs tends to provoke quite strong reactions as it makes a plea for broader multicultural approaches to the concept of the Gaeltacht, and it seeks to ask searching questions about the role of Gaels in areas like the colonial Caribbean. So to quote Ezeji, she says, "To understand Gaelic's position in the Creole societies of the past is for our language to have lived other lives, to have roots that spread beyond only one place. It is to have multiple stories, not all of which are positive. We must engage with the full history, with the truth." Now, Ezeji's framing here, very productive framing, I think, brings to mind the novel Marley, or A Planter's Life in Jamaica, which was published in 1828. This is a key text in terms of early Caribbean novels in English, alongside novels such as Montgomery, published in 1813 from Jamaica, or Creolana, published in 1812 here in Barbados. Now, the novel Marley remains anonymous, but its modern editor, Karina Williamson, suggests the Edinburgh lawyer John Stewart to be the most likely candidate as the author. The politics of Marley tend to emphasise the importance of gradual amelioration in order to head off rising demands for immediate emancipation in the 1820s. Now, the novel itself opens in 1816 with 2 young Scotsmen. The first is Marley from Edinburgh and his shipmate John Campbell from Argyll as they leap from a boat onto a wharf in Jamaica. In quite a memorable opening scene, they meet another Mr. Campbell, a Highland attorney who, quote, addressed himself in Gaelic to young John Campbell and, as Marley afterwards learned, he inquired for various persons in Argyllshire. Now, the Gaelic speaker, young John Campbell, is taken on immediately as a bookkeeper. And poor Marley, he pipes up, like, well, what about me? But Mr. Campbell asks, can you talk Gaelic? I have known some honest, worthy people, though they could not speak Gaelic. At present, however, I have no situation which would answer for you. Now, we do, of course, learn just later that there are, in fact, a number of vacancies, but, quote, the very Negroes warn, can you talk Gaelic? For if you can't, massa no employ you. Now, I'm often asked if this is true, right? Are there in reality kind of exclusively Gaelic-speaking estates in Jamaica? The answer to that is I don't really know. I don't really think so. If any of you have any more information about that, I'd be very happy to hear about it. I reckon it's a caricature of a certain clannishness, right? A kind of Highland clannishness. I think it's meant to be a joke. It's kind of a laboured joke to catch your attention in the opening chapter, much as I am using it just now. Okay, but this laboured joke does point to the visibility of Argyll connections in 1828. So to flash up the map here, the region of Argyll you can see is kind of on the southwest coast of Scotland. It's an intriguing area with key historic connections to Ireland. You can see that the bottom of the peninsula of Kintyre there is only about 13 miles away from the top bit of Northern Ireland. There are strong Gaelic connections which are captured in the name Argyll, the coast of the Gael, which would become Argyll. Yet Scots English speakers were planted there since at least the 17th century. And I admit that most of my material today is in English or Scots English rather than Gaelic. You can see the key towns in the region here are Lochgilphead, Tarbert, and down the bottom of Kintyre is Campbelltown. The name of the estate in Marley is Lochfine. And Lochfine is nowadays better known for the Lochfine Oyster Bar and Brewery, which you can stop off at on your way to Inverary. So I'll just keep Marley bubbling in the background for today as we look to focus on another Argyll man's text. This is Charles Campbell's prison memoir. Now, this prison memoir is a difficult and challenging text because it has at the heart of it a violent crime. This is a broadside which was published just after the crime in December 1825, and it gives the story of the awful murder of Sarah McVicker in Bridgeton near Glasgow. Now, Sarah was a young woman of about 18 years of age, working in a cotton mill in Bridgeton. She had a couple of relationships. One of them was with Charles Campbell, and she went out one night to a dance in Bridgeton and was dancing a reel. And that night, Charles Campbell, or she was stabbed by her sweetheart, Charles Campbell, in what the broadside describes as a fit of jealousy. It's important to say that Campbell never denies this murder. Rather, his memoir admits the awful murder, but pleads unsuccessfully an early version of the legal term temporary insanity. The memoir itself is full of heartfelt regret and anguish about what happened during what he calls a temporary paroxysm of madness. Now, I'm not qualified to judge on the legal aspect of the legal debates around that. What I'll introduce here today is the way that his memoirs are constructed. You can see on the title page that he flags up his adventures as a seaman and as an overseer in the West Indies. And this is a kind of an exploratory paper, so I'll be interested to think where I might go with this. I'm thinking here that we might be thinking about these experiences, particularly in Jamaica, contribute to a kind of a traumatic life which would lead up to the murder of Sarah. Now, this is a particularly intriguing text as it's neither a pro nor anti-slavery tract, despite appearing in the midst of emancipation debates of the 1820s. Rather than a stable work of ideological polemic, it's important to place it in the genre of prison memoir. So studies of particularly later Victorian prison memoirs suggest that the purpose is often to demonstrate the mental degradation that prison causes. However, these memoirs have a different angle. Instead, Campbell seeks to demonstrate the regained sanity of an individual who lives with the profound regret of his terrible deed. We must, I think, bear that framing in mind, this slightly self-exculpatory aspect as the primary driver of the writing. The politics of the memoirs are potent and uneven, contradictory and combustible, ranging across a sense of a plebeian or popular enlightenment, both racial solidarities and stereotypes, gendered violence, psychosis, and justice. I've given you the structure of the memoirs there then. The first edition runs to 29 pages. So the first section is devoted to his upbringing around Argyllshire. The second section then is devoted to his experiences as a sailor around Jamaica, and then his experiences, what he calls there an overseer, but in reality his description of his tasks more closely resembles a bookkeeper on Jamaica before his return to Scotland. So it's striking that so much of this memoir, more than 50% of the 29 pages, is devoted to his time in Jamaica. By the way, there is a second edition which comes out a few months later, which contains two lengthy editions. The first edition describes Campbell's escape from a press gang in Cornwall. We were talking about press gangs yesterday. And the second edition describes a white squall or storm just off the coast of Florida. Both very dramatic, traumatic events. In terms of his upbringing then, Campbell was born in Tarbert on the peninsula of Kintyre in the parish of Kilculumnell. His ancestors were the Campbells of Craignish, who settled at Escart Farm. And Escart Farm, Campbell actually describes what he calls druidical pillars, which we now call standing stones, which you can still go and visit at Escart Farm just outside Tarbert. That's a picture of him up at the top there. When he was an infant, his father quit the Highlands to travel to Johnston, Renfrewshire, to work in the warehouse of a cotton mill. At the age of 6 or 7, Charles was sent back to Argyll to learn Gaelic in Islay in the school of Mr. Beaton at Lagavulin. Lagavulin is nowadays better known as a whisky distillery on the island of Islay. He later returns to the West Highlands to eke out a living as a travelling medic, and he notes his mother sings Gaelic songs, and these Gaelic songs would recur to him in his later years. So the memoirs of this lower class Gaelic-speaking Highlander recall Marcus Rediker and Peter Linebaugh's formulations of the Atlantic working class, though we might look to revisit that concept as a less romanticised and more conflicted and tricky relationship. We get a sense from Campbell of a highly mobile and precarious life, with occupations that ranged from that as a sailor to a bookkeeper to a medic in the West Highlands and a cotton spinner around the time of the Radical War of 1820. Now, the Radical War was a week-long general strike and sometimes armed uprising of workers, particularly around the west of Scotland, which was crushed and its leaders killed, beheaded and banished. The preface to the memoirs addresses, quote, that class of workers, the Glasgow cotton spinners, with what he calls a kind of fraternal confidence, reminding them that I was one of their number in the days of their political conflict, and that my efforts were directed in defence of their disputed rights during the most arduous of their struggles, at a time when they were branded with the epithets which the public prints, the newspapers, were once liberal in bestowing. So he's making this appeal, right? I was part of that movement, that uprising, the general strike, and he's looking for and kind of highlighting that moment of kind of solidarity with his fellow workers. I'd just like to pause at the Radical War of 1820 to note the rise of historical scholarship over the last 25 years or so, which have made investigations into slavery the fastest growing area of Scottish studies. Increasingly, studies have mapped the Highlands and Argyll into the capitalist imperialist circuits in areas like the Caribbean, which are registered in texts like Campbell and Marley in contrasting ways. To summarise, Alan McInnes's pioneering work has demonstrated that both new landlords and older families, the Camerons of Lochiel, the McNeill of Tainish, and the Argyll Campbells, look to combine clanship and Atlantic commerce. So McInnes argues that the successful Argyll family, the Malcolms of Portalach, and their trade networks in sugar and rum, they took these profits which then funded improvements into Highland landholding. Carly Kehoe traces philanthropic payments in the Highlands drawn from imperial wealth. And in 2020, Ian McKinnon and Andrew McKillop demonstrated the entanglement between slave money, in particular the kind of slave compensation money from the 1830s, which went into the purchase of Highland estates, including some which were cleared of people to make way for sheep that we were hearing about yesterday. David Alston's narrative history opens up new ways of thinking about relations between what he calls slaves and Highlanders. Sheila Kidd notes that in 1828, this is our year of publication, 60% of the subscribers to the Highland Society of Scotland's Dictionary of the Gaelic Language were based in Jamaica. The UCL database shows that at least 30 addresses in Argyll claimed slave compensation money, including 9 in Campbelltown alone. Stephen Mullen's description of the Glasgow sugar aristocracy uses the term Clyde Caribbean connections, which for me I think is quite productive. It moves away from just thinking about the city of Glasgow or even just the small area of the merchant city of Glasgow to think about the relationship of the broader Firth of Clyde, which brings Argyllshire into close oceanic contact with the Caribbean, with a particular focus on the port of Greenock. And we were hearing about Greenock a little bit yesterday. Greenock actually became known as Sugaropolis, the city of sugar, given its the importance with that kind of West India trade. So I'd like to focus Charles Campbell's memoirs then into Neil Davidson and Jamie Allinson's analysis of 1820, the Radical War of 1820, which emphasises the broader story of Scotland's combined and uneven development, which pulled Highland agricultural workers into the mills of Renfrewshire to process slave cotton. It's this tangle of relations which produces the combustible conditions of the 1820 Radical War and propels Campbell between rural Argyll, industrial Renfrewshire and colonial Jamaica. Now, as Rona Brown has shown, certain of the newspapers indeed demonised strikers, and Campbell is at pains to construct himself and his allies as sober, industrious, and respectable autodidacts. And he does that through a whole wealth of philosophical and literary allusions. So perhaps alluding to Robert Burns's intended occupation as a Jamaican bookkeeper, which Esther Phillips referenced yesterday, he joins a debating club with regulations similar to those of the Mauchline Club, on which the name of Burns has conferred immortality. In the second edition, he also appears to draw parallels with the poet Robert Tannehill's paroxysm of mental insanity that resulted in the poet's suicide, and his own paroxysm of madness, which resulted in the murder of Sarah McVicar. To turn to Jamaica then. His time spent in Jamaica, he spends that roaming along the northwest coastline, the parishes of Westmoreland, St James and Trelawney, seeking work. And he's often detailing some of the precarity of that work, where you will do certain amounts of labour and then have difficulty in receiving wages from the person who employed you. This area is near what Olive Senior describes as the Argyll colony of Jamaica, where the action of Marley is largely set. And Campbell, I was thinking about Aaron Sood's analysis of sound studies yesterday, and it reminded me of this little moment in Campbell where he describes his Atlantic crossing with fellow Scotsmen who break out fiddles, and they're kind of fiddling across the Atlantic Ocean. He also describes celebrating Hogmanay, or New Year's Eve, at Montego Bay with a group of Scotsmen, half a dozen Scotsmen, in the manner of their forefathers. As I say, the memoirs are not ideologically, they're not an ideologically unified abolitionist tract. They are uneven and unstable. Yet it is clear where Campbell's sympathies lie when it comes to the Jamaican white elite. He dwells on descriptions of cruelty inflicted on the enslaved, as well as the, quote, poor, luckless tars like his shipmates. He also takes the time to emphasise the skilled medical care of an African nurse at Montego Bay, a woman who essentially tended him during his yellow fever and saved his life. At the same time, he's certainly not above descending into racial stereotype. In one really cruel observation of Daphne, an overseer's wife, he compares her to a simian. He makes a kind of a simian comparison. So kind of a nasty, obnoxious moment in the memoirs. We might also critique that Campbell's depiction of enslaved people tend to remain anonymous. Daphne is an exception. They are rarely fleshed out with names of their own. So I'll leave those critiques standing, and I'll turn to one key topic for Campbell, which I'm going to call a kind of a comparison of Jamaican labour. This is a question of who is actually doing the work. Because it's striking that in the early sections of Campbell's Jamaican episodes, it reads something like a plantation pastoral. He describes very pretty, picturesque estates with bubbling brooks and blooming flowers, and his own moments of ease and pleasure on those estates. And this stands in quite stark contrast to a series of texts which make quite a different comparison. So to turn back to Marley, our Gaelic-speaking John Campbell writes a letter describing his daily chores, mucking out the hen house and having to collect eggs. These are chores, he says, which makes his proud Highland blood boil. In the letter, Campbell writes, "I used often to pity the poor Negroes when I heard of the laborious work which the unfeeling white people made them perform. But little did I think that I myself should have to undergo more fatigue each day than the negroes whom I pitied. But it is the fact, and with the exception that the whip cannot be applied to my back, nor the stocks to my feet, I am not much better treated than the blacks whose misery I had so often deplored. So this depiction of labour, this kind of who's doing the real work around here, is echoed in another bookkeeper, John Kennedy's letter home from Jamaica to his father Duncan Kennedy in 1833. Now, Duncan Kennedy was a significant Gaelic poet and collector of Ossianic verse who moved from Argyll to become a Glasgow accountant. Now, Wilson MacLeod notes that Kennedy wrote a profoundly loyalist Gaelic poem denouncing the American revolutionaries in 1781, part of that kind of Gaelic pro-empire poetry which was mentioned yesterday. Now, this is an unpublished letter from John Kennedy. It's currently in private hands, in which John pledges to fulfil the promise that he made to his mother at Lochgilphead, which I reckon was probably a promise to pay off the family debts. Unfortunately for us, he does write home to his father more as an accountant than a poet. The majority of the letter focuses on what he can afford to send home. But he does, in this moment, list his duties on the Hyde estate in Jamaica, and he makes the observation, "How erroneous the ideas of the usage or treatment of the slaves you people at home form. You will not see here a cripple or deformed wretch standing in every corner of the streets or lanes begging charity, as in Britain. I went not long ago to inspect the Negro ground, and one of the slaves opened his press, asked whether I preferred rum, gin, or brandy, said he could give me a wine. I must confess I was not prepared to expect such dainties. I took a drink of gin and water. So much for slaves." So we note that in John Kennedy's letter home here, this is a kind of a life of ease, luxury that are enjoyed, that he is not able to enjoy as much as others. It's quite surprising that there was no mention of the Baptist War of 1831. By the way, this Hyde estate is the very same estate which one Zachary Macaulay, another bookkeeper from Argyll, from Inverary, worked on in the 1780s. And his own observations of the Hyde estate are quite different and motivated his later career as an abolitionist. Zachary Macaulay actually published his own tract, Negro Slavery, in 1823, and part of me wonders if Marley's Campbell, being from Argyll, is a kind of a subtle put-down to Zachary Macaulay. But what is striking is that this comparison of labour, which has this idea that, who are the real slaves here, is so absent from Charles Campbell's account, in which it's quite clear who is doing the work. The early sections of his description of his time as a bookkeeper read like that: plantation, pastoral. But this is all the more noteworthy given that certain strands in radical circles were increasingly turning against the solidarity with abolitionism they had displayed hitherto. To quote one radical meeting which took place in Ayr in 1819, they denounced Wilberforce, right? Where is now the boasted Wilberforce, the champion of freedom, whose philanthropic bosom was rent by the shrieks of the enslaved sons of Africa? Is it nothing to thee that Christians are murdered and enslaved, if heathens be protected? A kind of a charity begins at home accusation against Wilberforce. What we're seeing here, or kind of identifying here, is what Ryan Hanley has recently described as the birth of working class racism, where the organised forces of the working class tend into this kind of line of thinking. But this is absolutely not the line which Campbell is giving in his memoirs. And this is seen most strikingly in his description of the issue of the theft of sugar. And this is quite a key trope, I suppose, of kind of pro-slavery and anti-slavery writing. Is it possible for an enslaved person to actually commit theft in terms of taking or eating some of the sugar which they have produced? And Campbell writes one of my favourite sentences, I think. He says, "A West Indian slave is every whit as rational a creature as a Scots peasant or mechanic, and tinged with less vulgarity. I have conversed with slaves who could reason on right and wrong with as much and sometimes more good sense than some philosophers, slaves who were conscious of the birthright of their human nature and eyed their own degradation with just but silent indignation. Who planted the cane?" said a slave to me one day when I checked him for abstracting a lump of sugar. To check is a Scots word which means to kind of to upbraid, to pull up. He says, "Who nourished its growth? He watch over him, he cut him down, carry him to the mill, he make sugar. Shall Buckra man, who do nothing at all, and poor Negro man starve?" This was logic which might put a tyrant to the blush. So here the philosophy around the theft of sugar is redolent with these energies of the plebeian enlightenment, this ideas of the kind of this birthright of human nature. This fellow, I imagine, would be very welcome in the Mauchline Debating Club. Campbell's memoir avoids the question of kind of armed revolt and uprising, but it does eye with indignation the degradation of enslaved people, as well as the free peasants, mechanics, and spinners in the cotton mills. This indignation does point to the presence of history in the shape of the large-scale slave rebellions that tore through Demerara in 1823 and Cuba in 1825. Jamaica itself would soon be in open revolt in Sam Sharp's Baptist Rebellion of 1831. In closing then, I'll say that the plantation pastoral visions of the early Jamaican sections are shattered by a series of appalling and degraded punishments, descriptions particularly of enslaved women. His sordid depiction of white society in Jamaica shatters that pastoral vision. These are often extravagant, gruesome acts of violence, such as setting a body on fire, which makes impossible any kind of pastoral apologetics for slavery. And I'm still trying to shape where this would go, and I'd be keen to hear kind of thoughts on directions this might take. I think there is a sense of a traumatized and traumatizing landscape of Jamaica, which he carries home. We do wonder if the focus on his lists of descriptions of acts of violence against enslaved women is part of a conscious or subconscious reflection of his own violence against Sarah McVicar. The Jamaica episode clearly forms a key part of the construction of this memoir, in which he later describes what we might think of as a post-traumatic descent into psychosis. He describes the hearing of multiple voices and hallucinations of events which are happening through multiple walls. All of this leading up to his own act of violence against Sarah McVicar. So I offer this as part of a contribution to Cass's Edge's call. We're looking here for stories of Gaelic with roots that spread to places like the Caribbean, telling multiple stories, not all of which are positive, but we are trying to face some kind of truth, some kind of fuller history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. And similar to yesterday, we'll be taking questions at the end of this session. So I'm really pleased now to introduce our second speaker, the session, Dr. Daisha Osborne, who will be presenting on Hanu Madael, Blackness, Othering, Assimilation, and Reimagined Identities for Gaeltacht Settlers in the Caribbean. Dr. Daisha Osborne is Chancellor's Fellow and Lecturer in English and Scottish Literature at the University of Edinburgh. Her first book, Karuna, an historical romance in poetic form, was published by UE Press in 2015. She is currently writing a literary history concerned with Scots in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Osborne.
Thank you. So, thank you to Pater and Nigel. Thank you so much for organizing this event, and to Alessandra and the team at the Barbados Museum for hosting this memorable event. And I just want to say I echo all the other sentiments expressed in support for work like ours in the face of an increasingly violent, inhospitable world that in some ways resists difficult conversations and in other ways limits who can participate in those conversations. So as part of my ongoing research projects, those near completion and those just starting, into the various effects of Scottish and Irish presence in the Eastern Caribbean, this talk will explore archive records and printed material from the 18th and 19th centuries, well, more so the 19th century, that attempts to reconstruct Celtic identity in the Atlantic colonies through incomplete stories of people whose lives were forever affected by their presence. This paper will focus on the curious, frustrating, and over-repeated anecdote of the confused Gaelic-speaking man in the Caribbean encountering Black enslaved men for the first time. So before I begin, I want to share a quick note about citation practices, and you might notice there's a little red hashtag on my first slide there, and I've been doing this routinely now for the last few months at the beginning of every talk, so bear with me. The hashtag Cite Black Women was created by an assistant professor of African diasporic studies and anthropology, Dr. Christian A. Smith, to reflect the realities that Black women academics are the most undercited and yet over-resourced. The idea is, in the words of Smith, to push people to critically rethink the politics of knowledge production by engaging in a radical praxis of citation that acknowledges and honors Black women's transnational intellectual production. In other words, I come to you today as a colleague and not a resource. So I'm including my email address here in case something you see resonates and you wish to get in touch to engage further in dialogue. I'd also like to provide a content warning about some harmful language. Given the nature of the subject I'm about to discuss, it's important to sometimes read out and name the harm and sometimes just let it sit. So I won't read everything in the interest of sensitivity, but I also won't be censoring my slides. So, in the expanded edition of the British Colonial Library, published in 1837, the Anglo-Irish colonial civil servant Robert Montgomery Martin shares his version of an anecdote about the bewildered Irishman, the Connaught man to be precise, who arrives on the island of Montserrat to find an enslaved man speaking to him in Irish Gaelic, and his prompt departure at the thought of, quote, turning black. It is said that a Connaught man, on arriving at Montserrat, was, to his astonishment, hailed in vernacular Irish by a Negro from one of the first boats that came alongside. "Thunder and turf," exclaimed Pat. "How long have you been here?" "3 months," answered Quashie. "3 months, and so black already." "Hana Madail," says Pat, thinking Quashie a ci devant countryman. "I'll not stay among ye." And in a few hours, the Connaught man was on his return with a white skin to the Emerald Isle. The joke itself joins a library of other bewildered Irish peasant in the New World yarns that fill the pages of newspapers across the Caribbean, Canada, and the United States throughout the 19th century. like the one you see on the slide right there. This was another common story about the man who tries to convince the magistrate that he believed GFM, branded on a stolen sheep, stood for good fat mutton, and not the initials of the member of the landed gentry who owned the said sheep. The story, told by Robert Montgomery Martin, stands out for a few reasons. First is the choice of naming the location from whence this man came and ultimately returned to. One might argue that this is intended to make the story seem more real by adding more detail. I think there's good reason to argue that this specificity is driven by prejudice toward Gaelic speakers on his part. Martin was known for his proficiency in naming, cataloging, and archiving the history of British Empire as it was known in the first half of the 19th century. Between 1836 and 1837, Martin published what became known as the British Colonial Library, beginning with histories of Upper and Lower Canada, Australasia, Southern Africa, the West Indies, Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, the Sable Islands, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, the Bermudas, Newfoundland, British possessions in the Mediterranean, East Indies, and Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Born in Dublin, Martin allegedly studied medicine at Trinity College Dublin. There's no verification for this. And his publication histories include some really interesting versions of Irish history. I don't have time to explore this further, but his position on empire and his considerations toward the Catholic Irish populations in British colonies is summed up in this table he created for his History of the West Indies, in which he repeatedly creates tables like this to systematize the inhabitants of the Caribbean and British Guyana by a racialized sense of work ethic. The table is a demonstration of a now familiar racialized colonial hierarchy that existed in the Caribbean. More complicated and challenging frameworks are routinely overlooked and rejected in his histories. For instance, what occurred on Montserrat in 1768. Organized by a man only known as Cudjoe, a significant number of enslaved people planned a rebellion scheduled to begin on 17th of March that year, based on the knowledge that the majority of the island settlers would be preoccupied by St. Patrick's Day celebrations. And the plot was discovered and many of the leaders were violently executed. Martin's framework then disallows space to pose the more challenging questions about that delicate relationship between whiteness and belonging, often signaled by a severance and a chance at reimagined identities. And this has been the issue that has preoccupied me for the last eight years or so, and whilst writing my forthcoming study of Scots and their enslaved children in St. Vincent. Assimilation and participation in colonialism, slavery and empire have become the outward expressions of this almost forgotten diaspora in the Caribbean, and this is kind of what's bringing us all here together to these last 2 days. But nevertheless, some of those multiple and layered social debts that become not so obvious in other transatlantic or trans-Pacific, to big in a broader sense, diasporic communities still exist. The boundaries of belonging around Irishness, and particularly Irish diasporic colonial identity, to be specific, is and unbelonging as it relates to blackness, as it appears in so many settler communities throughout, from the mid-19th century, throughout the mid-19th century, in spaces like the Caribbean, Canada, and the US South, is not like other identities built in a space of diaspora. It is framed out of, as I said before, this sense of absence, this urge to identify all the missing pieces lost to violent uprooting, to time, and to the weight of history. Those of us who study the Black Atlantic and African diaspora during this same period of history and other adjacent fields recognize this simultaneous fascination and obsession, this impulse to name and connect new and old cultural identities, but for altogether different reasons. The presence of added frameworks of Celticness doesn't allow for parallels. It gives direction and destination to the complexities of where that uprooting, that loss of time, and the weight of history travels. Derek Walcott helps me make this point. In his Nobel laureate speech, Walcott famously conjures the image of a broken vase to give clarity to what can be understood as the crux of his argument. Break a vase, he says, and the love that resembles the fragment is stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. The glue that fits the pieces is the sealing of its original shape. It is a love that resembles our African and Asiatic fragments, the cracked heirlooms whose restoration shows its white scars. This gathering of broken pieces is the care and pain of the Antilles. And if the pieces are disparate, ill-fitting, they contain more pain than their original sculpture, those icons and sacred vessels taken for granted in their ancestral places. He continues, that is the basis of the Antillean experience, this shipwreck of fragments, these echoes, these shards of a huge tribal vocabulary, these partially remembered customs, and they are not decayed but strong. They survived the Middle Passage and the Fatal Razak, the ship that carried the first indentured Indians from the port of Madras to the cane fields of Felicity, that carried the chained Cromwellian convict and the Sephardic Jew, the Chinese grocer and the Lebanese merchant selling cloth samples on his bicycle. That realization, once overcoming the realization that for Caribbean people, recovery or recuperation of any sense of original or authentic culture is unique and should never be the goal of cultural celebration. Recuperation or recovery for the purpose of extending and deepening our historical understanding, if only for a moment or through permanent acts of imaginative rediscovery, has become an imperative. And again, to another point, Stuart Hall makes this point for us in his essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora. That identity is not only a matter of becoming, it is always contingent on acts of representation and continually reveal that interplay of African, European, and American identity. So, I say all that to address my use of the word Celtic, and I think that has demanded an explanation. Inverted commas done with my fingers are not sufficient markers to indicate any form of Celtic Caribbean, be it linguistic, geographical, or a matter of identity formation. Will most often be a matter of violence with little room for celebration. Violence was perpetuated on the bodies of enslaved African and indigenous people from the 16th century onward, and we've all been hearing about this continually for the last 2 days. Violence was also enacted on the terrain of these islands in the clearing away of tropical forests and local agriculture for the creation of sugar, tobacco, sea cotton, indigo, etc., and of the forced introduction of foreign flora and fauna to feed settlers and to feed the enslaved. Outside of academia, popular discussions of Ireland and the Caribbean have held on to this sort of imaginative account and presented as a historical artifact of a larger, and I should say rather insensitive discussion of Irish presence. So take, for example, the book Wherever Green is Worn, the story of the Irish diaspora, where the author speaks of a quote, solidly Irish gene pool being established in the 1690s on Montserrat, where communities were forcibly removed from St. Kitts after the English defeated the French. So coming back to Martin, to Martin's story for a minute, let's not forget that it doesn't make sense. If we can speculate what the Connacht man is doing arriving in Montserrat, it really shouldn't matter if he was indentured like so many of his other presumed social and economic, people who have shared the same social and economic demographics, or if he's there to take up a more violent and more harmful role in the management or overseeing of enslaved people. Despite those two variables, he likely would not have the agency to simply depart at the sight and fear of a Black Gaelic speaker. And another consideration to be made, and this is one that I'm not very I can't say much more about it, and this is the role itself of Gaelic in the tale, and how that in some ways marks the Connacht man as Catholic. And I'm just including this slide to show, from a digital humanities perspective, the possibilities of where this work can take us. I ran the phrase Hanum Madail from Martin's version through a text search on the Irish Academy's corpus dataset that was created to help scholars to date the presence of words and phrases in print. And surprisingly, nothing came up. So I reran a search for different variations of that phrase, and it turns out what Martin was quoting, what Martin quoted was not, it's something that sort of exists among, it was a type of interpretation of Irish Gaelic that exists among Anglo-Irish, and there's a lot more to say about that. So I reran the search just for that, just for the, I guess the word that the dial is based on, which is, I'm probably gonna mess this up, Joel. And again, I'm not a Gaelic language scholar, so there's only so far I can go with this, except to say that following the phrases opened up, I think, another avenue of discourse in terms of, you know, when certain words and ideas, and who do they connote, in a sense? Who do they signal us toward? It can open up another avenue of discourse. So Martin's particular choice of naming the location from whence this man came and returned to is directly related to the language he uses to represent him. On first read, he makes it it seems like he means to make the account seem more real, while the goal and result ultimately is pastiche and almost certainly prejudice toward Gaelic speakers. The Connacht man is presented as intellectually inferior, quick to emotion, thus making him unable to assimilate into a society where there is already an unpaid labor force being imbued with these characteristics. So while this is perhaps the most well-known version of the anecdote, it's not the only one. It's worth noting briefly that the story of the bewildered and ignorant Gaelic-speaking Irishman on Montserrat gets morphed over time into different colonial spaces for comedic effect before and after Martin. And this has been a very, I don't say enjoyable, but it's been a rabbit hole of going down with research. So I don't have time to show all, I don't have time to show all that I've collected, but here are just some examples throughout the 19th century. And the earliest so far in newspaper print is from 1822 in the American Masonic Register, and was published in New York City. A Negro from Montserrat, or Marygallant, where the Hiberno-Celtic is spoken by all classes, happened to be on the wharf at Philadelphia when a number of Irish immigrants were landed. And seeing one of them with a wife and 4 children, he stepped forward to assist the family on shore. The Irishman, in his native tongue, expressed his surprise at the activity of the Negro, who, understanding what had been said, replied in Irish that he needed not be astonished, for that he was a bit of an Irishman himself. The Irishman, surprised at hearing a black man speak his Milesian dialect, it entered his mind with the usually rapidity of Irish fancy that he really was an Irishman, but that the climate had changed his fair complexion. If I may be so bold, sir, said he, may I ask how long have you been in this country? The Negro man, who had only come hither on a voyage, said he had been in Philadelphia for about 4 months. Poor Patrick turned around to his wife and children and, looking as if for the last time on their rosy cheeks, concluded that in 4 months they must also change their complexion. Exclaimed, "Oh, merciful powers, Biddy, do you hear that? He is not more than 4 months in this country, and he is already almost as black as jet." This earlier version of the joke is presented from the perspective of the black man from Montserrat. His dialogue isn't included, only described. And in this version, the unlocalized Irishman has a family, adding pathos to the story of their ineluctable dislocation. The 1834 publications in the Dublin Penny Journal and the Thomsonian Botanic Watchman in upstate New York seem to follow the same template, but less localized. The Dublin Penny Journal version is just almost identical to Martin, and I suspect this is the source of his version, while the New York story seems to riff off of the 1822 version. The historiography of the account takes an interesting turn in the 1850s, and it seems to have it still has legs by the time it gets to Boston. It's too far away, so I can't read it, so I'm so sorry. While the 1854 version, which was published in the book by Samuel George Morton, is engaging in this sort of very interesting proto-evolutionary argument, or sort of anti-evolution argument. So for the racist American scientist Samuel George Morton, who identifies the location of the story as happening in Barbados, and the Hibernian man is from Norfolk, Cork. And just for reference, Morton this is the same craniologist who owned the largest collection of skulls in the United States, and most of it was taken from decapitated bodies of Cubans who died in the early 19th century. They were brought over to the University of Pennsylvania, and they were still on display and still being used until 2020. So this is the same man who horrifically helps to create a whole field of study in order to reaffirm these race-based hierarchies. So, if some of you are like me, then you like to browse old issues of Notes and Queries from the 19th century. And this is where perhaps the most interesting turn takes place, starting with a query from someone calling themselves Eirianach, which I'm assuming is a misspelling, who asks about mutations of the Irish language when it comes into contact with what he calls talkie-talkie or Negro jargon. And that's the last paragraph of that letter. And the response to this, 2 months later, comes from a rather fascinating source. Henry Breen was born in County Kerry in 1805. He attended the Irish College in Paris and later took a post in the colonial administration in St. Lucia and St. Vincent. He was a poet and a historian. And as an aside, I just want to just say that this is really where this work started. Breen was part of one of his novels was part of my PhD, and when I found this response to Eirianach, this was kind of what set me on this research while I was still doing the dissertation. Breen repeats Martin's account and uses it to purpose a lesson on how African-descended people on Montserrat adapted to the linguistic landscape instead of the other way around. So it's like an argument like it could never happen the other way around. Like there's in response to Eirianach, who wants to suggest that the Gaelic speakers were being affected by the African presence, and Breen is saying no, it's the other way around. 4 years later, a reader named JCG attempts to put the issue to rest with a quote from a passage from a poem by the Irish Romantic poet Thomas Moore, titled Paddy's Metamorphosis. And this is allegedly from an incident that happened 50 years since, which would take us to 1783. Now, I'll just read a few of just a few of the stanzas from this. About 50 years ago, in the days of our daddies, that plan was commenced, which the wise now applaud, of shipping off Ireland's most turbulent paddies as good raw material for settlers abroad. Some West India island, whose name I forget, was the region then chosen for this scheme so romantic, and such the success the first colony met that a second soon after set sail over the Atlantic. Behold them now safe at the long looked for shore, sailing in between banks and the Shannon might greet, and thinking of friends whom, but 2 years before, they had sorrow to lose, but would soon again meet. And hark, from the shore, a glad welcome there came. Arrah, Paddy from Cork, is that you, my sweet boy? While Paddy stood astounded to hear his own name thus hailed by black devils who capered for joy. And I'm just going to turn, I'm not going to read the rest, you can see for what reasons, and I'm just going to read the last two stanzas, where Moore offers the moral of this story. "'Tis thus, but alas, by a marvel more true than is told in this rival of Ovid's best stories, your Whigs, when in office a short year or two, by a lusus naturae, all turn into Tories. And thus, when I hear them strong measures advise, ere the seats that they sit on have time to get steady, I say, while I listen with tears in my eyes, good Lord, only think, black and curly already." Paddy's Metamorphosis was originally published anonymously in the Times of London, 2nd of March in 1833, from a quote, Irish correspondent. And then again, it was published again in Freeman's Journal, Dublin, a few days later, and it was repeatedly published throughout the 1840s, 1850s, and finally all the way into 1904 was the last time I tracked it, in the March 12th edition of the Irish Packet in Dublin. Given the presence of the 1822 version published in New York, Moore's poem, I argue, is not the original. It's not the origin of Martin's Connacht Man vignette, as the readers of Notes and Queries speculate in the 1850s. But it does highlight the obvious partisan reading and an allegorical fear of political sociogenesis brought on by participation in empire. I'm not the first to make an attempt to explore this specific issue, but with the rise of digital humanities, resources, and new methodologies, I think it's possible to reconsider what these mutated stories mean within the larger context of print culture as community building, within nation building, in a way that dynamically extends Benedict Anderson's well-resourced thesis about the rise of the nation in the 19th century. In the book Going the Rounds, Virality in 19th Century American Newspapers, Jonathan D. Fitzgerald and Ryan Cordell, these are two digital humanities scholars, they identify stories like that of Martin's Connacht Man and its variants as part of a large assemblage of common 19th century newspaper writing. The short prose piece that declares itself neither truth or fiction, or perhaps more accurately, proclaims itself both simultaneously. Fitzgerald and Cordell's identification of newspaper stories as vignettes, or short prose accounts that blend fact and fiction, anecdote and sketch, information and entertainment, to quote, lampoon the presence, this is my quote, to lampoon the presence of the Gaeltacht in the Caribbean has been useful. I appreciate Fitzgerald and Cordell's their choice of this term, vignette, considering its origin can be traced to Middle French word vigne, which means vine. And vignettes are the beginnings and ends of chapters, right? These are, once you see it laid out, you actually can't really find where the origin is. It just kind of like stretches out in every direction. So each retelling places it farther along in a sense, while the interpretation and audience are what change. On that note, this brings me to the Highlands of Scotland via Nova Scotia, where the Scottish Gaelic Studies, Michael Newton, attempts to unpack what he calls the myth of Gaelic-speaking Africans in North America. And he records an almost exact anecdote trafficked in the well-known Cape Breton Gaelic language newspaper, Mactala, in 1901. A certain Highlander went to Jamaica a few years ago. He arrived at Kingston safely, and when the vessel was anchored at the quay, many smaller boats came around to take the people to shore. The Highlander put his gear on board a boat in which were two black men, and he sat next to them. The boatman spoke Gaelic, but the Highlander didn't know that until they began to speak together in, quote, the tongue of the mountains. He was greatly amazed and thought that they must be Gaels. He looked at them for a while and asked one of them how long he had been in the country. The black man said, "About 6 months." "About 6 months," he replied in a fearful voice, "and you're black already. Take me back to the ship. I wouldn't want my face to be that black for all the rum and sugar that was ever in Jamaica." By the time we can trace the story to the 20th century, the story of the Highlander in Nova Scotia becomes repeated fact. For example, in Dwayne Myers, The Highland Scots of North Carolina, and Charles Dunn's Highland Settlers, both published in the 1950s. What I find even more fascinating, and this is drawing out of Michael Newton's work, that there is further evidence to suggest that this fanciful legend has its origins in the 1730s and the 1740s, where Scots, led by members of the Campbell family, the so-called gentlemen adventurers who traveled from their homes in Argyll across the Atlantic to the Carolinas, where they established settlements along the Cape Fear River. Meant to be amusing, very similar fanciful stories of poor Gaelic-speaking Scots encountering Gaelic-speaking enslaved people were presented to lampoon the former's unreadiness for life in the New World, almost 100 years before the story of the Connaught man. This new, purely speculative chronology places a story told first by Scots in the Carolinas in the early days of large-scale migration, joking about encounters with Gaelic-speaking enslaved people who were probably forcibly trafficked to the Americas from the Caribbean islands to where they were already Gaeltacht communities since the 17th century. Newton goes on to say that the teller of the joke and the listener know that the boatmen are not Gaels, according to racial classification. The humor of the anecdote is based on the disparity between language as identity and race as identity. It does, however, suggest the primacy of language as identity according to norms in place before the ascendancy of race-based classifications. Storytelling, said Newton, in its varied settings, has also functioned in a more practical way, serving as an effective means of affirming and maintaining distinctive cultural values, promoting social cohesion, stimulating the community and each individual within a larger Gaelic interior oral historical record, socializing children and teaching them about the world of adults, and maintaining the Gaelic intellectual life that had continued even after the aristocracy stopped supporting professional performers some 3 centuries ago. And he's speaking here specifically about the Nova Scotia communities. I think the broader context for the Irish vignette poses a serious challenge to this account. There is a deadness, and I can't find a better word for it, so I'm going to stick with deadness, to the enslaved man or men in every version of this story. His place in the story inhabits a kind of social death, and I mean in the sense that Orlando Patterson originally intended, this sort of metaphorical representation of that state of utter alienation, with no social ties recognized as legitimate or binding, who often make a social world out of death itself. So to conclude, the story and others are part of a project I'm working on, how to think about Irishness, particularly types of Irishness that are brought in relation to Blackness in the 18th and 19th centuries by Irish and Scottish writers. Irish and Scottishness. So I'm playing around with using that word Celtic without being problematic. So how these writers at home and in colonial spaces are using hybridity as a theme or a metaphor. Drawing on the conclusions of Fitzgerald and Cordell and even Newton reveals the endurance of a lasting strength of certain epistemological regimes. That the place of the Irishman in the story reflects ever-evolving notions of inclusion and belonging, while being read in relation to the African descended peoples used to make the joke. Those enslaved in the Caribbean and elsewhere, to paraphrase Catherine McKittrick, inhabits the underside of the category of man as human, and she's obviously taking this idea out of Sylvia Wynter. So Connacht man and the enslaved man, and even the Highlander are in terms borrowing from Fanon and Winter, sort of biological political matter. They're existing on points along this scale that slides almost infinitely toward the human. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osborne. I'd now like to invite our two speakers to come to the front, and we have a little bit of time for questions. If anybody has any questions, reflections on the two papers that we just heard. No? Yes, Nigel?
Thank you both. Two fantastic papers. What a great start to the day. I've got tons of questions for both of you, really, but I'll just start with one to Michael about the Charles Campbell narrative, which is written, as I remember rightly, when he's in prison. He's sentenced to, his death sentence is commuted on grounds of temporary insanity. Is that right? So I guess my question is, to what extent you rightly mentioned the ways in which the awful murder of Sarah McVicar has there is some underlying connection with the brutality and violence that he's describing during his sojourn in Jamaica. And you mentioned the psychosis as being like a post-traumatic type of thing. I mean, how do you think the way he writes that, and it's quite a strange and disturbing narrative of mental hallucinations and paranoia, that he's being followed, he's hearing voices, he's got this weird idea that he can think through walls and he can read people's minds and all that. What's his motive, the way he's presenting this book, because the book, I'm assuming, is a kind of apologia, trying to somehow clear his name. He can't clear his name because he's been convicted of a murder he's confessed to. But what's the motive for writing this book? And do you think there might be, given the date of publication, is there a way in which that might be seen as some sort of inquiry into the deep structures of racial violence that lead to mental breakdown and a kind of repetitive structure of violence that's manifest in the murder of McVicar?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think you can tell, sorry, is that one? You can tell that I'm kind of grasping a little bit at the moment in terms of where to go with this, and I think it might be down that route, and I think I've read accounts which are trying to identify this memoir as an abolitionist tract, and I just don't agree with that. I don't think it's ideological in that way, and I think that kind of self-exculpatory narrative that yes, this thing happens, but there is a context here, and there's events which have led up to this, I think is the main motive, and the motive, I think, is to try to get himself out of jail, right? And that shapes, I think, an awful lot of the narrative, and that's where I have to be a little bit suspect. At the same time, the descriptions of Jamaica are so striking and so powerful and so potent, and are shaped in ways which are informed, I think, by abolitionist language. And that, yes, it seems to build into, I guess if we were going down a kind of a trauma studies route, that Jamaica is kind of building into a traumatic midlife, which leads kind of, not inevitably, but leads unfortunately to this kind of awful murder. I'm intrigued if we could link it to other prison memoirs or prison accounts. I was thinking about Robert Wedderburn, right, who writes The Horrors of Slavery in 1824, and Wedderburn's a very different character, but we might think of these as prison voices where he is reflecting back on his own childhood in Jamaica, and his witnessing of atrocities in Jamaica, which led to his rebelliousness and his actions as a rebel in the 1820s. So yeah, I think it's all there. It's kind of self-exculpatory, it's suspicious. There are gaps and silences in this one as well. But trauma studies might be a route to go.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other questions or reflections? Yes, Dr. Shaw.
Oh, thank you. Hi, thanks both. That was a really great way to start the day. I don't know if this is very well formed, but I was thinking about genre in both of your cases. And as I said, I don't think this is very well formed. But Desha, could you talk more about this sort of genre that this taps into, or is it multiple different ones, and what work it's doing in that kind of way? Is this the only kind of trope, I suppose, of sort of the confused Gael in anywhere in the world, or is it specific geographically and is a specific sort of engagement? And I was wondering, and this is, I'm out on a mad limb, for you, Michael, something that I kept thinking about when you were talking was the Confessions of Nat Turner, which I know is in many ways not even remotely related, but also a sort of discussion of what led to an event. Maybe it's closer to the Wedderburn, I'm not really sure, but it just came up as something in my head, and I just wondered if you'd thought about it in a more confessional kind of genre as opposed to prison genre, but maybe those two things aren't so far apart. Thanks.
It's a question that I've been thinking about as well, genre. With the exception of Morton and Martin itself, almost all of the versions that I've been encountering have been these sort of short snippets in newspapers, and this is why I've really embraced that what Fitzgerald and Cordell are calling the vignette, because it's just kind of like a flash, something to hit you. And I think this is why so far, 100% of the stories have been located in the Caribbean because of Blackness, because Blackness is being used in this kind of stark metaphorical terms as the ultimate other, right? There's nothing you can go beyond that. That's what so the metamorphosis itself is. But it's still forming, sort of thinking about what the newspaper is doing as well, the immediacy of it, the fact that it carries long after the newspaper itself is gone. Like the stories then, because it's so short, you can just pass it on. So I think that's more of a statement on that.
The kind of, you're thinking about Irish paddy jokes as well on stage in the UK as well, and so it seems like a kind of Atlantic version of that as well. Brilliant, thank you for mentioning the Confessions of Nat Turner. I hadn't thought about that at all in relation to it, so I can follow it up. Thank you. Thanks, Jenny.
Hi, thanks to you both very much. I've also got lots of questions, but I'll try and narrow it down to one for Desha. I was really interested by the fact that you brought in Walcott's imagery and metaphor of the fragmented and broken vase, and I wondered if, because also laced throughout your talk, I was drawn to the references you were making to the digital humanities as a way to piece together kind of fragments of information, and I wondered if that, so, Walcott writing pre-digital humanities, if you like, but are you using that kind of metaphor, if you like, or that power of the idea of the broken vase in relation to what we now have the capacity to do with the digital humanities? Does it extend to your research?
Yeah, definitely. And that's why this is why the Walcott quotes have been so important in terms of like underlying and framing how we think about this, because it really is not until this work wouldn't exist without digital humanities a scholarship, the ability to think broadly. And I understand there's a lot of problems with, I mean, especially when it comes to what it means for Black and Brown scholars, this almost over accessibility or the ability to condense and turn into data. So I'm also very careful about how that works. And again, this is why the Walcott is so important, because it pays attention to the individual fragments. I'm not sure if that's answering your question.
No, it does. Thank you. Yeah.
So we probably have time for one more question. Yeah, Reese?
Thank you. Thank you for your papers, Dr. Morris and Dr. Osborne. This is directed at Dr. Osborne. I'm not sure if I was reading this correctly, but the idea of identity being tied simply to language was fascinating for me, because as a Barbadian, as a Caribbean woman, we very often are categorized by whether or not we speak in a certain way, and our Bajanness is often very much tied to whether or not we're speaking in a dialect. And very often when we encounter people from outside of the region and we don't speak in the way that they encounter people, maybe have a different part, from a different part of the island, maybe have a more countryside accent, and they're like, well, are you really Bajan? And people who don't fit into the idea of what a Bajan is supposed to look like. Like very many white Bajans I know from personal experience often ask, well, where are you really from? And that actually resonated with me, with this idea that the language, the way that you speak, is the only defining characteristic that most people will, the first thing that people will put on you. So that was just an observation that I had, and it was interesting that has been happening. That's not a recent phenomenon. That's a very, very much centuries old phenomenon. So that was just an observation that I had, that I wanted to connect those two things with. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, let's give our speakers another round of applause for a wonderful session. We're going to have a brief break now and resume at 11:30, I believe.
appear in the program. So, while there have been brief bios that are in the program, I do want to bring attention to some updated information. So first of all, I know Michelle Hinkson-Cox is on my right, and is the coordinator of the Associate Degree Program in Theatre Arts at the Barbados Community College, and served as the Artistic Director for Carafesta 15 in 2025. Yes, give her a round. She survived that. As a playwright and poet, her work focuses on producing work that focuses on Barbadian history and heritage, leading to her writing and staging nearly 30 original Bajan theatrical productions over the last 12 years. That's quite an output. Yeah. Her work reflects and experiments with Caribbean language, movement, and aesthetic, while sharing lesser-known narratives from our history with an aim to use theatre as a medium of building national identity in post-colonial Barbados. She is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, and Goldsmiths College in London. In 2023, she received a full scholarship from the Scottish Graduate School of the Arts and Humanities to pursue her PhD in theatre and archaeology with the University of Glasgow. That's Michelle. And next, I want to reference Dr. Natalie Maguire, who was introduced very briefly in your program, but I will read that bio for presentation purposes. And I note that Natalie is the curator of social history and engagement at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and the lecturer in art history at the Barbados Community College. She holds a PhD in cultural studies from the University of the West Indies at Cave Hill. And while I'm at it, she is one of the two curators, along with Harriet Pierce, who are responsible for two temporary exhibitions which you really should see before you leave in our gallery spaces. So are you going to talk about that? Great. So she's going to talk a bit about those exhibitions. Then I want to note Aaron Sood, who had been introduced already yesterday in the program, but I will reread it, particularly for those who were not present. He is lecturer in global pre-1800 literatures at the University of Exeter, a scholar and writer, an audiovisual artist. He is the principal investigator of the AHRC project, Plants, Plantations, and the Anglophone Caribbean, exploring botanical knowledge through text, archive, and orality. So Aaron, welcome again. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll greet all of them once I finish the last one. And finally, Montserratian Yvonne Weeks is a very welcome presence. She's a writer, arts educator, and academic. In 2005, she won her first prize in the Frank Cullimore Literary Endowment Award, Barbados, for her memoir, Volcano, published by People Tree Press, which was later published in Spanish. A major, major work, I have to say, Yvonne, yeah. The evocations are endless. Yvonne has published drama, poetry, fiction, and academic articles, too numerous to mention, in over 20 anthologies and journals, and is editor of 2 anthologies. She has received multiple awards, including Best Director for her short film, Grief, and is recognized for her contribution to arts, culture, and education in both Montserrat, where she was the first Director of Culture, and Barbados. She holds a PhD in education from the University of the West Indies and has lived in Barbados for 30 years. I want you to welcome our speakers with a round of applause, please. And now I'll turn the floor over to Michelle Hinkson-Cox to speak first. 5 to 10 minutes each.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you very much, Alessandra, for that introduction, and good still morning, I think, to everyone. So as Alessandra would have mentioned, I'm here primarily in my capacity as a playwright. And my philosophy as a writer is to tell our stories. I'm very unapologetic about that. In fact, my very first play in 2014 was one that I was told to write most unceremoniously when I was working at the National Cultural Foundation. And it was a play that was based on the 1937 rebellion here in Barbados. My experience at that time as a writer was zero, so having to now write a play with some level of historical accuracy was quite intimidating. But I was truly encouraged, particularly by Kevin Farmer, who was somewhere around. But Kevin from the museum, her deputy director of the museum, Kevin was very instrumental at that time in teaching me about how to do historical research and to then take that historical research and use it to create what would essentially be speculative fiction. My relationship with the museum grew from 2014 and continues today. We would have started the Torchlight Tours here at the museum, and what the Torchlight Tours did essentially was to take the exhibits in the museum, whether it was the temporary exhibits or the permanent ones, and put performance to them, invite an audience in, because one of the things that we noticed was that we weren't getting the kind of breadth of audience that we wanted from the local community. So how do we reach them using the performing arts? And the Torchlight Tours was born out of that process. In 2017, because I teach at BCC, and I think it's an occupational hazard, so those 30 plays really came out of necessity. It is often quite difficult when you say, I only want to do Caribbean or Barbadian work. It's difficult to find work that always fits the class that has to perform. So by virtue of necessity, I started writing more often. And in 2017, we had a very peculiar year. Anybody who's a teacher will understand the peculiarity of having only one female in your class. And I think we had about 8 males. So I came back to Kevin and I said, Kevin, I don't know what I'm going to do for these kids. I have nothing. And Kevin said, why don't you produce Tempest? I have to put my disclaimer here. I am neither a student of literature nor history. So when he said to produce Tempest, I knew that Tempest was a Shakespeare play. It wasn't on the CXC syllabus my year, so I never read it. So I had to go back, I read the play, realized the connection of it being staged. You know, a number of scholars have said that it's Caribbean-based. And I liked the idea of Tempest, but there was something that did not sit right with me, which was that I felt that we needed to tell it from our side. I'm going to take a very quick pause and just show you the introduction to the play, and I think you'll get a sense of what I mean by telling it from our perspective.
Look! There's more of them! These ones look harmless. Ayo! Scatter! A pleasant good evening to one and all. I said good evening, one and all. So, wanna come here to see a show? You can miss? Yes. Well, this ain't like the story, one and all. In fact, this one might shake the border right out the rest. I am Calaman. And this is my friend Ariel. Welcome to our home. We can call it that, because with the device and the to make this place our own. So in this little story, when I get here, we're talking about the who's, the hows, and the wheres. And the upcoming sequence of events. Remember that nothing may happen without our consent. Because the one thing we want to know is that Calaban and Ariel together outsmart Prospero. So what happened was...
So if you know The Tempest, you know that this story basically is about how Prospero came. It's the story of colonization. And what I wanted to do was to tell the story from the islanders' perspective, to give the power back to the people who lived here. So the entire story we know is about, there's all this magic that happens, and we attribute it to Prospero. But I've said, no, this is the subversive nature of Caribbean people and Barbadian people. We allowed him to think that he had the magic, but we were controlling it in the background. So it was quite a fun production, and it was my first experiment, I think, into not only this type of Caribbean theater, but also looking at how do we really kind of unpick our own stories and tell the stories that were not previously told, because we know the old African proverb that history is written by the hunter and rarely by the lion. So I reimagined the play completely from that perspective. We had Caribbean characters throughout. So for instance, the character of Miranda was played by Adam Laurent from Trinidad. Again, my time at St. Augustine very heavily influenced the work that I do. But I think that for me, what really made that particular play stand out was not the play itself, but it was the comments that came from Baba Kamau Brathwaite, who was one of my mentors at the time. And if you know Kamau's work, he did an extensive study on Calaban and Sycorax. And it was his endorsement of the work that was able to then really catapult me forward into looking at this type of representation. You'll notice that I am wearing what in Barbados we call plaid. It's a Scottish tartan. And this is my family tartan. So my family is of Scottish heritage. And one of the things that I wanted to explore was, what does that mean for us? Because we've heard so many different stories about the Scottish in Barbados. Some of them came across as prisoners of war. Some of them came across as owners of enslaved people. So what does it mean for us? And we've been doing quite a bit of research in the family on our genealogy. And so it was really quite heartwarming when Alessandra actually wrote the recommendation for me to study with the University of Glasgow. And everybody who hears theater and archaeology kind of gives me that quizzical, huh? Like, how did you put those two things together? But for me, the play, the actual play is an artifact. It is an artifact. But aside from the play being an artifact, it is also a tool. It's a method of inquiry. And it's a way of making history accessible to the regular folk, not just the academics who are going to come to the seminars and the presentations, because more often than not, we are here preaching to the converted, right? So how do we get more people to come in and to engage with archaeological findings and historical narratives? How do we also get us to learn more about ourselves? And I am looking at how we can use theater and the play as artifact in that way. And I'm just going to read a quick quotation from Susan Laurie Parks, who's an African-American playwright. And she says, a play is a way of creating and rewriting history through the medium of literature. It is the perfect place to make history. That is because so much of our history has been unrecorded, dismembered, washed out. One of my tasks as a playwright is to locate the ancestral burial ground, dig for bones, find bones, hear the bones sing, write it down. I'm working theater like an incubator to create new historical events. I'm remembering and staging historical events which, through their happening on stage, are ripe for inclusion in the canon of history. Through each line of text, I'm writing the timeline, rewriting the timeline, creating history where it is and has always been, but not yet been divined. And that is the source for the work that I'm currently doing, called Exhuming the Silences. I know we had some people who would have attended the production over this weekend. And what it looks at is telling our stories from the transatlantic enslavement of African people to Barbados, but telling the stories from the perspective of the African people, not the perspective of the enslavers. Looking at the runaway slave ads, which have been digitized by the Barbados Mercury, and finding ways of engaging and interacting with that history in meaningful ways that give us a clearer sense of our identity. And I'll read a quick extract from one of the poems, because it is a mixture of poetry and text. Stepping lightly across an assuming surface, dust churned to mud by heaven's tears. You were here. White hands, oppressors' echoes, covered with synthetic gloves, now hope to uncover truth, uncover you, standing still. Light brush shifts topsoil gently, layers of pain concealed by centuries. Amnesia? No. I feel you. Knees buckle under weight of memories never lived. Head hangs down, hands clenched in burial ground. Soul gains consciousness, you beckon me. White brushes, white blows, white hands unearthing exquisite pain in layers below. Fragments found. Cuts of clay once dormant, now disturbed from resting place. White eyes ablaze, discovery. Black eyes awashed with tears, vision clear, finger imprinted. You are here. Black hand holds remnants of you, generations apart. Touch meets touch with heavy heart, horror and beauty in equal parts. And that poem was written based on one of the archaeological digs which I would have attended through the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And coming out of that poem, coming out of the text of the runaway ads, we were then able to, well, I was then able rather to craft a script which looks at various elements of that period of enslavement, coming up even to the 1816 rebellion. And certainly there's a lot of questions that come out of this type of work, because when you're saying you want to represent people who are no longer with us, they can't come up and say to you, well, in natural terms, you're not doing it quite right. So there's a heavy amount of research that goes into it and a lot of ethical considerations, because whose story am I telling? But also, who's the person that's listening to the story? Who are the people that are listening? And who's benefiting from this story being told? And those are key questions that I've been asking from my time at Goldsmiths, and I continue to ask now at the University of Glasgow. Because this type of work, when you're talking about archaeological research, I am proposing that any type of historical play, particularly of these types of plays that are dealing with difficult narratives, these are the plays that we really need to treat with the kind of precision that you would treat at an archaeological dig. That kind of care, being able to take the topsoil off layer by layer gently. It is that kind of care that you want to take, certainly as a writer, when you are now representing the lives of these people who are no longer with us but are still very much also with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And now we'll move on to hear from Natalie. Natalie, your turn.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you to Alessandra, to Pater, to Harriet, Kay, all of the organizers for the invitation to be a part of this roundtable. And it's really been an honor and a privilege to learn about all the scholarship regarding Irish, Scottish, and Caribbean connections over the past day and a half. I have a very modest contribution to this roundtable under the idea of curating and communicating historical connections, but really pleased to share some reflections on the curatorial approaches to the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, particularly in relation to how we engage with the archive and how that engagement is deeply tied to questions of colonialism, memory, power, and community, which I think have been some themes that have been discussed in the undercurrents of everybody's presentations over the past day or so. At the museum, when we talk about unpacking colonial legacies and power structures embedded within how cultures communicated in Barbados, it's not something that we regard as a task that necessarily has a completion date or a completion goal. Rather, it's an ongoing process of unlearning. So in that regard, we often use the term anti-colonial alongside decolonial because it's important to acknowledge that resistance did not just begin now in the contemporary moment, but Barbados has about 400 years of resistance to British imperialism, and that continues in nuanced ways today. So for our museums, this means that anti-colonial curatorial practice cannot simply be about revising labels or diversifying collections. It requires a deeper interrogation of how museums themselves were formed, what kinds of knowledge they privilege, and whose voices were historically excluded. There's been a lot of scholarship about the role of museums emerging as deeply colonial institutions, including by Caribbean scholars such as Wayne Modest, Andrew Small, and Alessandra Cummings, where the establishment of museums functioned as sites where conquered objects were displayed as evidence of imperial dominance, and that collections became symbolic extensions of empire itself. As this moved towards the decline of what is considered formal empire in the 20th century, museums started shifting to try and fill a gap for constructing a new national identity in the former colonies. And this transition was shaped by a movement that was developed in Europe called New Museology, which advocated for museums to move away from prioritizing objects to prioritizing stories. However, they were still trying to neutralize the museum as something that exists beyond the political realities of a particular locale or society that it existed in. So that model, as these Caribbean museums started to emerge in a post-colonial context, were never really sufficient, or I should say neo-colonial contexts. These models were never really sufficient within the Caribbean. There had been interventions in Latin America, and despite our geographic and cultural closeness with the region, however, we still adopted a lot of the Eurocentric models through international partnerships, inherited institutional structures for the way in which we developed curatorial models in Barbados. And this sometimes obscures opportunities for approaches that emerge directly from localized experiences and community knowledge. However, there has been an increase in Caribbean scholars who have critically examined these tensions, and these conversations are particularly important when reflecting on the history of this museum that we're all at here today. So this museum was established in 1933 by an Act of Parliament and was originally founded by a predominantly white Barbadian and British elite. Like many museums of the 20th century that I just alluded to, the collections focused heavily on natural history, archaeology, and objects associated with imperial privilege and plantation life, while the experiences of the wider Barbadian history, including that of the enslaved and working-class Barbadians, were often erased or marginalized. Revisionist work at the museum accelerated in the 1980s and 1990s, and the museum increasingly embraced the idea of being for people, about people, expanding educational outreach, traveling exhibitions, and community-based programming, recognizing that communicating history could happen and should happen outside of the walls of the museum as well. And I say all this because it's from that foundation that the more recent curatorial projects at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society have been able to emerge from, particularly those engaging critically with the archive. Our historic photograph collection, for example, prompts us to ask layered questions, such as how do we engage images not simply as historical records, but as visual constructions shaped by colonial power? How do we untangle the visual hegemony embedded within the depiction, particularly of Black Barbadians in the late 19th and early 20th century? And crucially, how can the interpretive authority move beyond the museum, beyond the curator, to actually include a multiplicity of voices? So these questions are central to our current work on the life of Harriet Thomas Weeks, articulated through two exhibitions that we have on currently. Harriet Thomas Weeks' The Right to Opacity, which was co-led by myself and our librarian, Harriet Pierce, and Jocelyn Gardner, a Barbadian visual artist, her solo exhibition, Am I a Bad Girl Nanny? Cries of Innocence and of Experience. The basis of these two exhibitions come from a donation or series of donations that the museum received between 1957 and 1970 of two ambrotypes dating from the 1850s from a donor, Beatrice Sinclair, depicting a Black Barbadian woman, Harriet Thomas Weeks, with an annotation from Beatrice identifying the sitter as such, identifying her also as being mixed race, and whose mother had been enslaved, and therefore she had been born into enslavement, and who had been with Beatrice's family for 3 generations. This was a really rare instance in 19th century Barbadian photography, where the subject had been named, providing a starting point for searching for her within the archive. Using church and civil records, registers of the enslaved, newspapers, and other archival collections, we traced Harriet's life from her appearance as an enslaved child on Newcastle Plantation in Christchurch in 1817, through her relocation to Mount Wilton Plantation in St. Thomas, where her connection to the family that she spent 3 generations with, which was actually called the Douglas family, and here's my tenuous link to the Scottish and Irish theme of this symposium. Douglas is thought to be a Scottish surname, where her connection to that family developed. The research also uncovered evidence that Harriet herself had a son, James Lessingham Weeks, while raising broader questions about family connections, identity, and the lasting impact of enslavement on Barbadian lives. Harriet's story reflects both the possibilities but also the limitations of colonial archives, demonstrating how these fragments of documentation, combined with access to private collections and photographs, can in some ways help recover parts of the histories of ordinary Barbadians, particularly women whose experience have often remained absent from the historical record. And those fragments offer a powerful glimpse into a life lived during one of the most transformative periods in Barbadian history, spanning the period of enslavement, emancipation, and the uncertainties of the post-emancipation era. However, our curatorial methodology does not attempt to create a definitive biography of Harriet. Instead, we recognize that archives are partial, mediated, and shaped by colonial systems of documentation. They're not to serve picturing the humanity of an individual, but rather as ledgers, as accounts. These absences are as significant as the surviving material, and therefore we employed a practice of curatorial listening, one that was attentive to the silences, conjecture, and contested memory. So we're situating the museum as a site for multivocal interpretations, and you see some examples of that on the slide from all of our contributors who have engaged, shared in the knowledge as we developed the research and the content for this exhibition. And we see this as a crucial way to be reparative to an archive that has traditionally prioritized a singular colonial gaze. So we instead offered a nuanced reflection, and to quote Kamal Brathwaite, of a submarine unity throughout our fragmented archipelago. And what we hope emerges is this continual layered evolving tapestry of encounters with Harriet and her story. The underpinnings of this curatorial approach draw on decolonial methodologies from Edouard Glissant, Temi Odomuso, and Sadia Hartman, and intentionally resist the impulse to know Harriet fully. So just briefly touching on how these engage with the methodologies, Sadia Hartman has described the colonial archive as a site of both possibility and violence, warning that its documents can become scriptural tombs, textual enclosures, in which the lives of the enslaved are entombed, rendered legible only through the language of property, loss, and control. Hartman cautions against the uncritical repetition of these records, asking whether such acts risk subjecting the dead to, quote, a second order of violence by reinscribing their injury rather than attending to their humanity. So this project takes that warning seriously, refusing to animate Harriet's life through speculative certainty or narrative closure, and instead acknowledging the limits of what can be known. Temi Odomuso's work on colonial photographs and archival ethics further sharpens this curatorial stance. She writes on the effective weight of images, particularly of the enslaved and colonized subjects, and urges cultural institutions to move beyond access and visibility as unquestioned goods. She proposes an ethics of care and acknowledges archival materials as repositories of affect and trauma. She sees the archive as not merely a source of information, but a relational space in which institutions must ask how they host the dead and under what conditions their images and records circulate. And then finally, Edouard Glissant's articulation of the right to opacity offered us a crucial counterpoint to the archival impulse to clarify, complete, and possess. Glisson argues that opacity is not a failure of understanding, but an ethical position, a refusal to reduce the colonized other to transparency, comprehension, or sameness by the colonizer. He insists that relation does not require full knowledge, and that insisting upon it risks reproducing domination. So opacity, for Glisson, is the ground upon which genuine relation and respect can emerge. And applied to our exhibition, opacity allows Harriet Thomas Weeks to remain irreducible to the archive that names her. Rather than forcing coherence where none exists, we acknowledge absence as meaningful and silence as instructive. So Harriet is approached not as a problem to be solved, but as a life to be honored. So in conclusion, or in summary, rather than presenting a singular authoritative narrative, this exhibition opens up space for multiplicity, speculation, and dialogue. And we invited artists, historians, community members, and visitors into this interpretive process. So in this sense, the museum becomes less a fixed repository of truth and more a site of encounter and questioning and shared meaning-making. How the museum is attempting to shift from being a place where knowledge is simply held to one in which knowledge flows. At the Barbados Museum, we're still grappling with a lot of our colonial inheritances, and there's a lot of work yet to be done. But these collaborative and community-led approaches that emerge through our work offer hopeful directions for the future of Caribbean museology, and the archive remains central as a living and contested space through which historical connections can be continually reinterpreted and shared. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And now we'll turn to Aaron. You want to do your presentation next, please.
Hi there. Thanks so much to you both for those powerful reflections. Yeah, I feel very humbled to be part of this panel, so thank you for the invitation. I thought I would use this time to broadly reflect on creativity in relation to archival materials, with specific reference to some of my previous work and ongoing projects. So I come to this topic as an academic, but also a creative practitioner. And in recent years, my work has increasingly turned to audiovisual and sound archives, which has in itself been a departure from thinking about archives solely as collections of historical print-based materials, or even digitized texts predominantly reserved for academic use. So on that note, I think it's worth underlining the importance of audiovisual collections as repositories of intangible cultural heritage, encompassing performance, oral traditions, songs, rituals, and a plurality of languages and dialects. And it perhaps goes without saying why this is of particular importance in both Caribbean and Scottish contexts in all their pluralities, while also acknowledging the challenges of availability, accessibility, funding, resources, and institutional investment required to develop and maintain such archives. So today, to give you some examples of projects in which I've creatively engaged with both print and audiovisual archives in the context of the Highlands and Islands, before finally reflecting on my current work in Caribbean contexts. I previously worked on a project called Searching Erskine on Art, Ancestry and Place, which responds to the uninhabited island of Valley in North Uist, the Outer Hebrides, Scotland. The project comprises an art book containing a cycle of poems, a series of monoprints, a 12-track album, and it was accompanied with an exhibition that contained several printed materials as well as moving image works. So for context, the island of Valley lies approximately 2 miles off the northwest coast of North Uist in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. On foot, it can only be accessed for a limited time at low tide, and it's been uninhabited by humans since the early 20th century. And my grandmother was one of the last to leave the island, sparking my initial interest, but also because the island's cultural and environmental history has gradually fallen into decay, which is where I thought creative engagement could play its part. A central figure in the island's history is Erskine Beveridge, a textile manufacturer turned antiquarian and photographer who built an Edwardian mansion on Valley in 1905 to conduct archaeological investigations and write several books, And in later years, my grandmother was a housekeeper for Beveridge's son. Beveridge's mansion was lavish in its Edwardian heyday, making the present-day ruins all the more striking, where bright red paint gives way to bright algal greens. So over a number of years, I visited Valley and this quite magnificent ruin, and I camped, I consulted photographic materials where they were available, although there weren't many, conducted interviews with former inhabitants or their descendants, took field recordings in the form of field recording the sounds of nature and the sea and so on. And I set these kind of layers of sound to new compositions which comprised the 12-track album, and this became a way of mediating a sense of connection with the place and its past. During my research, I was also struck by Erskine Beveridge's attentions to sea levels and climate in the early 20th century, as he observed great changes in both climate and the relative lands of the sea by measuring the length of roots and branches embedded within layers of peat. Taking these archival materials as points of inspiration, I collaborated with the North US based printmaker and artist Rosalind Blake on a series of two-plate monoprints. So these monoprints reflect on the tidal island as a site of environmental precarity, where human habitation and non-human forces are continually reconfigured by the movement and rising levels of water. So in this way, creative engagement with oral, print, and visual archival materials became a space for both cultural revival and ecological awareness in some capacity. And I here wish to highlight this link between cultural and biological diversity, prompting me to propose a question here that if cultural loss is also ecological loss, might cultural repositories such as archives, and particularly audiovisual archives, and creative engagement with them be a way to resist, repair, restore, and advocate? These themes have also come to form a current project, which I'm coming to the end of at the moment, which is a forthcoming collaborative album with the folk singer Angeline Morrison. And this is called Don or Du, which is brown, black. And this was initially inspired by some of John Purser and Meg Bateman's ideas in Window to the West, a book which asks us to consider whether there's anything distinctive about how Gaels through the ages have looked at the world, examining conceptions of environment, vision, shape, patterns, and also how colour has been represented in the language. Of particular interest to me was their commentary on the 10th century canto Salta and Aran, where the directions of winds corresponded to different colours. In this formulation, westerly winds were considered dark brown, while northern winds were considered black. And this idea of the winds corresponding to different colours continued into the 19th century. For example, in 1868, Robert Louis Stevenson also wrote of a black wind in a letter to his mother from Wick. So taking this as a point of departure, I began to explore representations of colour with a focus on black and brown in Gaelic songs and stories. And I searched through histories and songs collected in the sound archive Tober and Dulchas, or as it's known in Scots, Kisto Riches. So I was very reliant on this sound archive in pulling together these experimental representations, but also during the process of research, I chanced upon an archival recording of my great-uncle, Archie McClellan, who I never met, singing and playing the fiddle. He'd been recorded in the Arnamurchan Peninsula in the Western Highlands of Scotland by the folklorist Francis Collinson in 1952. And while ethical approval for a direct use of audio material is generally difficult, I did manage to obtain permissions for these recordings. So I'm going to play you a very quick clip of the original recording and then how I've used that for an album that's coming out in August. Okay, I'm going to cut that there and just quickly, I know that time's running down, so this is my reinterpretation. Okay, so it goes into a bit of spoken word there as well. So I'm sharing this really as a personal testament to the ways in which audiovisual archives have the capacity to reactivate the past, our ancestors, cultural heritage, and foster environmental awareness. But this, of course, comes with complications and poses challenges, not just around accessibility and availability, but with regards to that questions of ethics and responsibilities to communities. So, for example, my approach to materials in Scottish collections is, of course, inherently different to the way I would treat, I would treat materials in, say, the Elizabeth Watson Audiovisual Unit at Cave Hill as an external researcher. It's highly unlikely that I would use them in the same way as I did, for example, with my great-uncle's recording. And so to briefly expand on that point, as part of my current AHRC project, I've been researching representations of sound in natural histories of Barbados, including numerous references to Indigenous and African-derived musical and oral cultures in the work of Richard Lygon and Griffith Hughes. But to engage and enliven or, say, activate these archives, say, through creative practice, sound or visual art, would, in this context, require trusting in ethical forms of collaboration with communities, musicians, and artists, which in turn requires time, relationship building, and most likely further funding, which are all challenges in their own right. And I just wanted to end by saying how powerful I thought that metaphor of the dusting of the topsoil of an archaeological dig was as you approach the creative act. I think that it's also important to consider, as you're dusting off that layer, what's your positionality, or like, what's my positionality while dusting that off, and who needs to be involved in this dig, and is it possible, So I found that really powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. Aaron, thank you so much for that reflection. And now we turn to Yvonne for the final part of this presentation on the Irish Montserrat connection.
Let me just say, I was not at all aware of an Irish Montserrat connection till I was an adult. So I'm going to present in kind of three parts. So recently, last year, I received Eccles Institute Fellowship to do some research on the Montserrat Jumbi dance. The Montserrat Jumbi dance is an African spiritual practice that has almost virtually disappeared. And I'm very happy to see Clarice Barnes from Montserrat in the audience, who's here on vacation, because she has been doing her bit to make sure that it doesn't die out completely, but it did. So in my research, which I'm doing at the British Library, I really began to reflect on my life as a Montserratian. So I'm not talking as a scholar here. I'm talking as a Montserratian. So I went to live in Montserrat in 1968 to 1973. I never heard anybody refer to us as Irish. I remember a video, which is still available on YouTube, which talked about our Irish names and the names of our Irish villages and our Irish plantations and streets, etc. And even then, it made absolutely nothing to me, because the thing that was the main focus at that time, not seeing what happened, is it the other way around? What was happening at that time was that there was a resurgence, not sure what's happening, to the right, okay. There was a resurgence of everything that was African. And I want to introduce you to 4 people who are absolutely important to this narrative. One is Edith Bello Allen, who is actually Dominican, but she lived in Montserrat as far as I know my whole life. And she started the Cavite Chorale in Barbados at Cave Hill. And we learned African songs, African dances, African folklore, African narratives. There was no mention of Ireland. Then Professor Dr. George Irish, who worked for many years at the Medgar Evers College, he actually had something called Know Your Past. And that was a huge thing for me at 13, 14, 15. And I have to say, I'm still teaching my grandchildren the songs that I learned at 14, 15, all of which are African. No sign of Ireland, except in the passport with the shamrock, which confused me because Montserrat has no shamrocks growing on the island. Then, so that's the first part of my story. The second part of my story, I go back to Montserrat in 1987, and we celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And again, it was about the fact that 9 slaves were hung and that 30 were punished. No trace of Ireland, except it was the Irish plantation owners who was drinking and carousing on the 17th of March, in which the African enslaved decide, we're going to try and overthrow them. And that's when, by this time I have a big child, I realized there was an Irish connection. Moving on, Annie Dyer Howe then fought for the right for us to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Montserrat is the only island outside of the West that celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Right, so fast forward now to my third life. I am now Director of Culture in Montserrat, and I am excited because the only thing I know is the Africanness of who I am. So I am planning, Clarice, slave feasts, drumming, play called The Great Overthrow, written by my late cousin David Edgecombe, and I am being told by tourism and the powers that be, we have to have rum crawls, pub crawls, forgive me. We have to serve green beer when we go to these different pub crawls. Oh, we should also have a leprechaun float. And suddenly everything was green. It was at that moment, and I was more than 30, as a Montserratian, that I realized there was an Irish connection. So I'm being very truthful. We were never taught it at school, nothing. And so there began the political battle of will between me and the policymakers and the tourism. The year before the volcano erupted, some American media came, and I first then recognized that I would be called Black Irish. Never heard of it before. And so I want to say these things because there is a way, and Professor Howard Fergus, who has passed, his history books are absolutely essential reading because he says the Irish connection is both superficial and permanent. Make of that what you will. And so our memory, I feel, is problematic. All right? So March 17, 1768 was when they had this slave rebellion. And going back now to my fellowship, as I sit in the British Library, I realize, oh wow, much of the history is being either deleted, expunged, and erased. So if you go to school in Montserrat at this time, you're not going to, well, I don't know if you're going to learn the folk songs coming a day. What we know is that everything I learned as a child about Montserrat, about Cudjoe, about the sacredness of the silk cotton tree, I don't know what's happening now, and it frustrates me. So I'm going to miss that because I want to stick to my 5 to 10 minutes. So we have competing activities happening. We have a fete called the Leprechaun Dust Fete. You could laugh. And then we have people like Clarice and my friend Shirley Osborne, who's not here, who want to do Drum Fest. They are competing, but fortunately, Clarice assures me the Drum Fest is growing. The leprechaun fest is really green powder. It's a fete, all right? But that is what we are promoting, so we get tourists. Then, of course, if you look on your, is it my left? Yes, I'm a theater person, I should know which one is my left, right? You see the men them wearing their kilt. I cannot comment on that anymore. And then you have, to the right, you have a group of very beautiful women who understand that it's African people that we are. But how did the Irish come to Montserrat? They first came running away from persecution. They were Catholics. Montserrat was a safe haven. Then after that, maybe about a decade after that, they came as indentured laborers. But we don't see how they became plantation owners. And we don't see, at least I have not seen in any of Howard's books, how they went from coming there, running away from persecution, becoming indentured servants or laborers, to being plantation owners. So when you see these wonderful BBC videos that speak to our Irish names, since we had no surnames, we simply took the surname of the plantation that we worked on. Don't laugh, Anthony. Simply, since we had no surnames, we took the surnames of the plantation owners. We took any surname, according to Howard Fergus, and all of his textbooks are in the British Library. What am I doing now? So we have this cultural tension. On the left, we have this traditional masquerade, rooted in Africa, rooted in African practice. And on the right, we have, in 2018, men embracing their Irishness. So before I go, have time? Because I like to stick to time. I want to just say that what my research showed as I'm doing this research, I'm not a historian, but I have been taking the history and coming up with creative ways of expressing these narratives. I try to do what they call triangulation in that I try to find people who practice the dance. So I would have spoken to a number of Montserratians who would have gone to the Jumbi dance and who would tell you that, like me, they didn't know anything about Ireland until Ireland became very important for whatever reason. But the cruel treatment of the enslaved, there is some anecdotal references in the text by Fergus that the Irish were not as cruel as the British. However, the Irish plantation owners burnt alive in Plymouth Town a man who stole a goat. All right? So that, of course, when the rebellion was crushed in 1768, they hanged the 9 people. So even Howard talks to the fact that linguist John Wells can only find one Gaelic word in the Montserratian language which links Montserrat to Ireland. So, having been told I had to have a leprechaun float and that the beer had to be green and all of that, the volcano erupted that job and I came to Barbados. So, to close, I want to just share 2 last words. A poem, Michelle. A poem. I did teach her, so you never know, it might have rubbed off. And this one is called Death. The Jumbie dance gone, the Jumbie is frayed light. The turning gone for good, the backwardness gone, the obia charms gone, the obia man gone, the shadows gone, the devilry gone, the drums gone, the babbler gone, the woo-woo gone. All the sounds travel behind God back. Slowly, a new darkness creep over my Alawagana, like when the whale swallow up Jonah in its belly. Yeah, a new darkness came, slithering hot and curdling over the island. Fearing darkness, people fly into the glint of the sky, and now even the red madras disappear. Now is only green shamrock, African men wearing Gaelic kilts. Black faces are doing the leprechaun jigs. And in the growing darkness, the people start to drink green beer under the silk cotton tree where Kodja was hung. And the altar, the candles, the rosaries, the saints shine brighter. My people turn white and Irish now, not white like Irish snow, white like when them see Jumbie, when them see themselves in a mirror, and they have no eyes, because them can't see through all the green and the sweat and the sunlight and the bodies that walking up on top of one another, and the shamrocks and the screwdrivers flowing down their scorched throat through barbecued smoke, and green handkerchiefs are flying, and them roots and them culture gone, so they can't see nothing left, not one thing. And that's me, done.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Okay, before I open the floor to general questions, I thought I would look to the panelists and see whether you wanted to do any sort of response to any of the presentations. So I'll do a few minutes of that. I'm going to allow the presenters to say a few words to each other in terms of reflection on what they've heard of the various presentations. We'll take a few minutes of that before we move on. Any responses? No? No? Yes?
I think one of the things that comes up in all of our presentations is this idea of the ethics of care and recognizing that we are representing a people who can't represent themselves, but that they are represented through the work that we're doing in these different media. So I'm really happy to know that that is something that is a thread, I think, that goes through what all of us are doing on the stage, and it's quite refreshing to see that.
Thank you.
Can I just add a quote that I wanted to end with, and I didn't find it. It's by Sylvia Wynter. It says, colonialism tried to control the memory of the colonized, or rather it tried to subject the colonized to its memory, to make the colonized see themselves through hegemonic memory of the colonizing center.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Any other reflections, Aaron, Ashley? No? So I now open the floor to general questions. We still have enough time for that. Do we have any questions or comments from the audience? Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much to all of the speakers for a really stimulating discussion. Can I start by asking Yvonne to maybe elaborate a small bit on terms? You've mentioned the BBC representation and the American networks kind of coming to Montserrat. Could you say a little bit more about the timeline of when you feel that sort of began, or what your sense is of when that moment kind of arrives in the culture of Montserrat, in terms of that sort of external eye, perhaps obscuring something there?
So part of the early discovery that we had this Irish connection is also associated with Air Studios. So what was happening is that American artists, Stevie Wonder, Earth, Wind and Fire, Sting has a video that was filmed in Montserrat. Every little thing you got is magic, da 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 da. I can't sing. Montserrat became a place that, first of all, nobody knew who we were. We were like, you know, the smallest island almost. And suddenly, Hollywood people started to come, right? And they would come with their bodyguards, et cetera, et cetera. And so Air Studios, George Martin, was really putting a very tiny island with just under 12,000 people on the map. So then it became a place of intrigue. There ain't no violence, nobody getting killed, you leave your car open, you leave your house open, no crime ain't happening. So it was a very safe space. And that safe space then became a point of a lot of interrogation. So the Smithsonian came and they went to, Clarice remind me, Trans, and they found the Amerindian site, and it became a very global space. And then, of course, that global space became more under the microscope when the volcano erupted. So I would trace it to that. But then, if you lose 8,000 people, most of whom have gone to the UK, what, really and truly, they're in a catch-22 situation. What are they to do to get people to come to the island? And so it's really, for me, a marketing strategy, right? How do you get maximum Montserratan who now live in the diaspora to come back? In 93 or 94, I believe, BET came, and that was the end of us as far as I'm concerned, because they were filming, and because BET was coming, I was director of culture, was under pressure now to produce goods, products, so they could keep coming back. I left in 96, and I go back fairly often, and it's quite sad, because I think there are children being born in Montserrat who don't know why there's St. Patrick's Day, who don't know about the execution, or the hanging rather. They don't know why they can't disrespect the silk cotton tree. One year I went to Montserrat and they wrapped green madras around the silk cotton tree. Clarice, you was there when they did that? I went crazy. I was like a mad woman. How you could do that? And I remember discussing it with Anthony. They wrap fabric around the silk cotton tree, and not even African fabric. You know, this green madras thing that don't have nothing to do with us. So I think that's what really happened. So we had these points, right, where Montserrat suddenly got national attention. You know, when Stevie Wonder come to Montserrat, Montserrat gonna get national attention. When this thing do a video, Montserrat's gonna get national attention. But other than that, to me, it was like a sleepy, peaceful island where everybody related to one another. Nobody cared about the Irish surname, because we know how it became our Irish surnames. That makes sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating perspective. I'd love to talk to you more about it afterwards. I won't bore everyone.
Let me just say it's my perspective.
Oh, you know, I'm conscious of that. Yeah, no, I'm very conscious of that. Yeah.
Nigel?
Thanks to all the panel. That was an amazing, very vibrant, very challenging set of talks. Thank you. My question really follows on from Patter's, and just reflecting on when I came over, and probably like others in our party, when I came over on the BA flight from Heathrow to Bridgetown, nearly everyone else on the flight was a tourist. And I got chatting to a few passengers, and they said, "What are you going? Which beaches are you going to?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'm coming to a conference to co-organize a conference." And they looked at me in complete amazement. Why would you go to Barbados to a conference? You know, people from the UK go to Barbados for a holiday. It's about tourism. And this is what you've been talking about in relation to Montserrat, because clearly it's the commodification of Montserrat through the sort of commercialization of the St. Patrick's Day thing, which is a global phenomenon, of course, as well as a Montserrati phenomenon. And of course, that's one thing that Scotland, Ireland, and Barbados, like other Caribbean islands, have in common. They're tourist destinations. They're places that are targets for commercial tourism. You've got better weather here. That does a lot of the work for you. But nonetheless, we have huge numbers of tourists coming to Scotland, and I know it's the same in Ireland, despite the challenging weather conditions. And tourism and what's now being called over-tourism are posing an increasingly grave problem to our culture, not just because of the way in which the cultures are represented in a stereotypical way for easy consumption by globalized tourism, but also the impact that over-tourism is having on communities. The fact that local people can't afford to buy houses, that all the property is being sold off as Airbnbs or as second homes. Young people can't afford to stay, they're all having to leave, and I know that's a huge problem in the Caribbean as well. You mentioned the huge number of Montserratians who have to emigrate to, and the same thing is happening on a more minor scale, in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands. The Isle of Skye, for example, is in the summer months, you can't move it's just jammed with camper vans and tourists, and I think a lot of local people, if they get away, they go away. So I just wondered if you could, tourism is often something we don't like to talk about. I'm very interested in its origins in travel writing in the Romantic period, which is the beginning of a sort of more elite, it gets sort of more democratic and more commercially available. But tourism is often something that's just left out of the picture. We don't discuss the tourist gaze. We don't discuss the role of tourism. It's something that, we just don't want to think about. I wonder if any of you could reflect on how the question of tourism and maybe over-tourism impacts on your own cultural production here in Barbados or elsewhere.
People are looking at me, so I suppose I'm supposed to respond. I'll actually start by echoing something that Yvonne said earlier, and she was reflecting on Montserrat and some of the children not knowing. We were the same production that you would have just seen this weekend. In our process, because for me, as I said, the theater is archival. So there are a number of things in all of my plays that archive my family history, but they also archive Barbadian experience, Barbadian history and heritage. And there were so many things, references, that I think everyone here in present audience will think is normal, like the mortar and pestle. And the children were like, "What's a mortar?" They had no clue. And if you ask them, however, about the latest, I don't know, I'm not as young as I look, so forgive me, but the latest game on Roblox or any of these other things, they can just rattle it off and go. But there is such a distilling of our culture because of the tourist gaze, I think, being a serious, one of the serious reasons for it. And I remember when Queen Quet from South Carolina, the Gullah-Geechee nation, when she came to Barbados in, was that 2019, I think? It was a conversation I had with her was very similar. We would have had, all of the display of the Mother Sally, our traditional characters. And it was Mother Sally, Stiltman, Steel Down. So all these different characters were on display. And she came to me and she said, where's your real culture? Because she had done her research and she was aware that these were not, as we would call it, pretty mass characters, but what was presented to her was pretty mass. And if you go back to Crop Over and the, coming up of Crop Over in the 70s and 80s, it was done as a festival for tourist consumption. So we did lose a lot of our indigenous cultural expressions through that. But I think that there are a number of artists, big up Risé as well, there are a number of artists who are working within their disciplines to bring that knowledge back into the community. And I think that's very admirable because you're seeing it happening almost kind of organically. We're not necessarily having conversations with each other about, okay, how are we going to do this? But there's several artists right now who are looking at that and saying, no, but there's no reason why we cannot produce this. And one of the things for me that was very encouraging about University of Glasgow, when I started doing the writing of the PhD, I had these subtitles, because I write in dialect, in the actual text of the document, not just in the script. And I had dialect written in there with subtitles saying, this is what it means. And one of my supervisors said, if you were writing in Spanish, would you have subtitles? Your language is valid. Use it. And if anybody wants to know what it means, let them go and do the research. Because we have to begin to put the value on the things that are culturally ours as well.
And to continue on from Michelle, so
Yes.
many years ago when when I was on the committee developing theatre arts and performing arts at the CSEC, which is like O-level. If you're from the UK or Scotland, it's GCSE. Right, so we have a similar exam at 16 and 18. And when I was arguing about getting qualified teachers in the schools that understand cultural form and understand storytelling and wake and landship, a key policymaker said to me, well, we're only having these subjects on the syllabus so that we could entertain the tourists when they come at the port. Yeah. And I was like, no, we need to train teachers to teach the subject, right? And his answer was, well, the maths teachers are complaining too. And I was arguing that you can't have a social studies teacher teaching landship. You can't have an IT teacher teaching wake and storytelling. And that's actually what is happening in our schools, which is why we're seeing these devastating results, which is why we are seeing young people with no interest whatsoever in practicing art. Or they go and do a degree at either BCC Art Associate or UE, and then after they leave, they have absolutely nothing to do with it. So the rest of us who are determined to still direct plays and still write plays and still paint and still do, we are very much a minority, right? And I would say that most of us, Michelle, even though Michelle and I are generations apart, we're all doing the same work, but differently. Amanda, we're all doing the same work. We all realize that if we're not careful, we'll be recolonized. We might actually be recolonized already.
Aaron, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to the discussion, which was yesterday I reflected a little bit on this idea of the double fracture, which is Malcolm Ferdinand's term. So, coloniality in the Caribbean is vastly transforming the landscape and simultaneously vastly violent towards African lives and knowledges and culture. So there's this simultaneous kind of transformation of landscape and damage to culture. And I can't help but think of that when you're describing tourism, in the sense that you have a simultaneous, again, transformation of landscape or the aesthetics of landscape at the cost also of your cultural practices, whereby in order to facilitate that mass tourism, you're having a certain type of festival or a certain type of celebration. So I think it comes back maybe just like a sort of external reflection to that link of biocultural diversity, like the importance of thinking about culture and environment together and the consequences of one on the other. And I think that we have that in the Highlands and Islands to some extent, but to a very different extent. I don't think they're ever going to build a mass Hilton hotel on the Isle of Harris on its shores. You never know, but I think you never know. Well, that's true. You never know. But at the same time, you have huge problems, particularly in certain islands, with secondary homes, with the loss of local culture, with depopulation. That also function to serve a form of kind of exclusive tourism. So I don't think that there's like direct comparisons, but that reflection or that kind of causal link between landscapes transforming and that affecting people, I think is worth reflecting on and holding on to maybe.
Very strong connections. I think, the tourism industry as it stands today is a result of very intentional picturing of Barbados from the 18th century through paintings and imagery that were produced to serve the colonial project. And so in many ways, tourism perpetuates a lot of the oppressive structures of the plantocracy this filters down into heritage interpretation, cultural performance. There is also a branch of tourism that feeds into academia. There's academic tourism. And so I think, coming back to what I wanted to say is why it's so important that we have scholars like Michelle who are, working in the field of your own research and study, and visual artists in particular are starting to intervene and respond to this idea of a organic touristic experience or existence that we have here in Barbados. And yeah, so.
Thank you. Amanda, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your 4 different presentations, very thought-provoking. Maybe just to follow on from what Arun was maybe implying, I think over the last 2 days, what comes across from all of these presentations is just that, an intense desire for an ethic of care in terms of our place in the world, not just presently, but certainly historically. And so Yvonne, you spoke passionately to that when you talked about sort of the place of the African heritage and culture in Montserrat and the contestation there between that and others, so to speak, if I would say that broadly. But I wanted to ask Natalie and Michelle to reflect on something, if possible. Natalie, you talked about this business of opacity when it comes to the presentation of histories, of people's lives. And if I get the quote correct, you talked about resisting the closure of narrative. And Michelle, you talked powerfully about this business of, which Aaron referenced, dusting off and to sort of uncover what is there, and then being very careful. Both of you talked very much about the care that goes in these endeavors. To me, when I think about it, the visual presentation of documents is a performance in its own right. They're being presented for others to view and to engage with, and similarly, theatrical work, so that there comes a time where there's a certain amount of structuring the performance work that is involved. In the case of the theater practitioner, well, yes, what words do you put to the mouths of those whose voices you can't hear? And similarly, Natalie, how do you select, how you stage the work so that people, how they perceive it as they're moving through? And you talked about the closure of narrative, but even the structuring of the work has its own kind of narrative flow, if you see what I'm saying. I was just wondering if you could reflect on that. I'm not saying that they're contradictory ideas, but I'm seeing sort of like the idea of the performative in both of them, and I just wondered if you could reflect on that. Yeah.
I think from a curatorial perspective, the opening up to multiplicities of voices, like multivocal ways in which we interpret particular narratives and stories, becomes key. So we're decentralizing this idea of a singular curator, a singular voice through the institution holding any kind of authority over the way in which an object is encountered or engaged. A couple of the methodologies that we've been developing in order to approach that include a community of curatorial practice and rhizomatic museology, which becomes very lateral, so moving from a structure that is top-down to something that is growing without any kind of identifiable center, and is looking at very kind of micro-level moments of engagement with particular stories rather than huge mapping exercises, which is where those kind of generalizations and those structures come about. So while what you describe is kind of very traditional curatorial approach or museum approach, where the museum has a tombstone label that gives you facts and figures and they're supposed to be held as truth, then it's all very, denying of any kind of bias in the way in which that interpretation is displayed, and the museum is meant to be neutral. We're kind of turning that on its head and saying, actually, we recognize that museum interpretation is not neutral, and one ways in which we're attempting to combat those inherent colonial legacies and biases is by broadening the scope of interpretation to include multiple voices and community voices in the ways in which we present a layered approach to exhibitions. So I hope that, yeah.
And I think that for me, the approach that I use is very much one that has been developed through working with the museum. From the very beginning, the museum would say, we want to do a production. For instance, I'll use the same one from this weekend. It started when we wanted to do the anniversary of the rebellion. And again, laying my cards on the table, I am not a student of history, so I know there was a rebellion. We have a statue that we call Bussa, which really isn't, but you know, we kind of have this knowledge of it because I wouldn't have been taught history, Barbadian history in school. So my process has always been one that is very much like what Natalie's saying. The museum will come and say, we want a production on this. They will offer some of the archival material. Depending on what it is, of course, I can't do it with the 1816 rebellion, but depending on what it is, I'll go back and speak to the elders in my family. You know, get that oral history research in as well. So there's several different layers of research, but when the script is written, it doesn't end there for me. I have to send it back to the historian. I think I saw Dr. Aline, there we go, Dr. Aline, when we did Millie Gone to Brazil, which is one of our Barbadian folk songs. It was based on the text that Dr. Aline wrote. It was a back and forth. So there is a deliberate attempt on my part as the writer to ensure that it is not just me having a creative moment and producing a piece that I say, oh, look, that sounds nice for stage. But I'm very careful with the historical elements of the play because we are representing people. My students get a little antsy with me because I go to the point of, as a linguist as well, my background is in linguistics from St. Augustine, and as a linguist, I will say to them, you know, in 1816, they probably would not have said, big man. You know, I try to get them to even think about the nature of the language that is being used, understanding that the language of 2026 is also not the language of 2016, and learning recently from my daughter that, you know, I come from back in the day, because back in the day now is 2014. So understanding all of those little elements for me is critical to being able to write the play. And then there's another level, because theater and the exhibit, they're both communal. I don't write the play and then I direct it and I act in it and it's all me. It's a community that put this thing on stage. So I have to give it to my director. We have conversation. I give it to the actors. We have conversation. There's a back and forth reading that's all a part of the dramaturgy of the work. The students are encouraged to go and do their own research, come back with questions, challenge me if you found something that might not quite fit, which is actually what happened with Millie Gone to Brazil, because that was written originally for the museum. And when Dr. Aline published the book, I went, oh wait, that completely disrupts the narrative that I had. So we went back to the play and we reproduced it. So there has to be that back and forth and that communal type of engagement with the different players. I specialize in historical narratives for theater. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be some level of creativity, but the historical narrative is very critical to me, and I'm hoping that at the end of my PhD, what we're going to have is a model that says, this is the approach that will help you to reproduce these types of works for history, yes, but also for other difficult narratives that you may have, that you may want to stage. So I can't say too much because it's a work in progress, and I'm not going to put all my research out there in the public just yet. But the reality is that for me, I am creating that model that says, this is what you can use to make sure we have that ethics of care, that representation for the people who are being shown on stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please give. Okay. We can have one more question, but Philip, your turn. Please keep it brief, and then we are going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid, because
okay, I'll try and keep it brief. It seems to me that the focus has been very much, on early Gaelic nationalism coming into the Caribbean, encountering a kind of African-oriented nationalism, white British nationalism, And I think what gets lost in this whole process is the whole Amerindian presence at that early period, which has to be seen, and a lot of the focus, therefore, seems to me to be on island-based nationalism, whereas the Amerindian population was essentially sea-based, was essentially nomadic. And it seems to me that history, the kind of history that is done that focuses on these on individual islands kind of misrepresents that whole Caribbean history as an archipelagic history. And I think it raises a question, for example, for instance, with Michel's piece on Caliban. What if Caliban was an Amerindian? How would that be presented then? So you have, it seems to me that there are very different ways of approaching this process of different kind of nationalism encountering one another in the region. Ultimately, it seems to me there's an issue around creolization that nobody seems to want to discuss.
Philip, when I write the play again about Caliban as an Amerindian, I will give you credit for that idea. Thank you. But absolutely, I agree with you. There's an Amerindian presence that has to be investigated. Right now, because of what my funding has required for my research, it is very specific in terms of the groups that I'm focusing on. But like I said, the model that I'm creating is not specific to transatlantic experiences. It is specific to, let's go back and talk about the narratives that have not been spoken about before. So absolutely, I believe that is one that can be explored much more. It is one that I am also quite interested in, having lived in Trinidad and experienced some of the First Peoples there and their cultures. So it is something that I am looking for as well.
Thank you. I think that is a good and opportune time for us to end the proceedings today, and I want to thank all of you for your active engagement, your participation, your reflections. I know, to me, it's been highly enriching, and I'm looking forward to continuing the dialogue and the exploration of these other aspects of our heritage, the Gaelic Caribbean, the Scottish and Irish, and Caribbean connections. I want to say on behalf of the museum that we are very happy to have hosted you for these last 2 days. And I thought, Peda, perhaps would you like to say a few words to close the event and for us to move on to the important part of refreshments. There's a microphone up here. Mm-hmm.
I hadn't budgeted for this, so it'll be very brief. But just to thank, I already spoke yesterday, but just briefly today, as we wrap up, to thank all of our speakers, Michael and Desha this morning, and this really stimulating and wonderful roundtable this afternoon, which has, I really think, been an excellent way for us to, in one sense, end a series of conversations, and in another different sense, start a series of other conversations. So with that in mind, we maybe might do that over some refreshments. And thank you all for coming.
Also wanted to do a quick vote of thanks to Harriet Pierce for the lead organization of the local organizing committee, as well as she was assisted by Chelsea Osborne, Kay, Alessandra, also Elizabeth, who is going to be taking some of you on a wonderful tour after refreshments, and of course, Anastasia and Jason for all of their support with streaming and for the setup, and of course, Brian and Travis. And if I'm forgetting anybody, I'm sorry, but thank you to everyone.